This is the Hebrew Zoom lesson for April 30th, Part 4. Shalom, shalom. Now here's an even more interesting numerical value for you. And it's just a little tangent to do some numerical values, and then we'll go back to the other subject. So in Exodus 3:18, and if you remember, Emunah has a numerical value of 102. I can show you that again in a moment, how that adds up. But Exodus 3:18 has a word, and in this case it's Elohim again, but it's Elohim conjugated. So in 3:18 what you have, there's a little hole on there for the vowel, and there's a vowel under the aleph. So you get Elo, right? And then you get Hey, because it's a Zere vowel. Elohenu. Elohe, so we usually would spell it like this. And what that means is our God. I'll turn to the verse in a minute so you can see the context. But our God, we get 1 for the aleph, you get 30 for the lamed, you get 5 for the hey, you get 10 for the yod, 50 for the noon, and 6 for the vav, right? So you get 66, 71, 101, 102. So when you conjugate Elohim as our God, you get 102. Let's turn to that. So go into eSword again. And this time we're going to Exodus 3:18. So here at the end of the verse, Moses is talking about going to sacrifice, talking to Pharaoh. We have to go into wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. That's Yehovah Eloheinu. Our God is 102. Now here's one that I found, one last numerical value, but this one was, I think, the most amazing of them all. In Genesis 15:6, where I said Abram believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness, that particular verse, which is one of our verses in question here, for the Aman, right? And remember, Aman in that form has a value of 91. We've already looked at that. But remember, the numerical value changes as we conjugate a word. The root word has letters added or vowels added or prefixes, suffixes added, subtracted, and so on. So what it actually says in Genesis 15:6 is it has the letter Vav in the beginning. And what the letter Vav is, if you remember, is the word and. So it says and, right? And it has what's called the hifal form of the verb. So we're not going to go into the advanced Hebrew to explain all of that, but this is a form of Aman, and you've still got the root in there. You got the aleph, the mem, and the noon, but you have this prefix in here with the hifal form, and when you start to add it up, you get Vav is 6, Hey is 5, aleph is 1, mem is 40, and then you get 50 for the noon, right? So you see the root is 91, the Aman part of it, but then you have an extra 11 here because of the prefix. And when you add that extra 11 to the 91, you get 102. And if you remember what 102, what I was saying is 102 is a numerical value of Emunah, faith. So surprising coincidence. I don't really believe in coincidences in the Word of God. God makes the numbers match. He's that smart. He's that much of a multitasker. But this is Emunah. And we said 1, 40. This is where you're furiously writing notes, I suppose. So you can look at this later. But if you take Emunah and you get 61, 101, 102. We looked at that earlier, but the way that Aman is conjugated in Genesis 15:6 is actually 102. The Aman is the base word that Strong's gives, like the basic form of the word. But as you conjugate that word Aman in this verse, in that particular form, it has a numerical value of 102, which matches the numerical value of Emunah. Very interesting, I think. Right? When Abram amaned, he actually did it in a conjugated form that equals the same numerical value as Emunah, where the water has saturated the seed and brought forth fruit. So we're speaking of mature faith there. So now I want to take a look at a spiritual lesson, an application of what we've been learning here. So you have Amen, which I would say is a one-time action. It's a behavior, right, where we agree with God. And if I were putting it in the context of churches that I know, we could call this the sinner's prayer. We could even call this coming to church, maybe, and listening to the sermons, showing some interest. Some things we agree with, other things we don't, but not jumping all in and making a full commitment. This is a one-time action. Maybe it's more than once, but it's one time, and a little while goes by, and then one time, and a little while goes by, and one time. So an action of agreeing. But then as you go a little deeper, you have Aman, right, which, remember, means to believe. To believe is an attitude. So Amen, to agree in that sense, I mean, it can be very real. It can be a seed, right? We're looking at this as the seed. The Amen, the yes, is the seed. But it's the repeated lifestyle, the repeated action of belief. We believe in the agreement, so therefore we repeat action which agrees with that agreement. It becomes an attitude and a lifestyle of watering the seed. And then we move on to Emunah, which is where you get the fruit, right? Remember, the pictographic meaning of Emunah is you have the water is now saturated. The seed and the water become one. And out of that comes the hay. And the hay, we said, represents fruit, which it does. And it also represents grace. So when the full measure of grace or favor is released in a situation, is when we reach mature faith, where we've watered the seed and we've worked through the cycle, the process, and it actually starts to become part of our identity. This is what we talk about with Romans 12, for example, where it says to be renewed in our mind, part of the changing of our identity to be conformed to the image of Messiah. So one of the largest ways that we become conformed to the image of Messiah is by operating in faith. Faith is extremely basic, it's foundational, and as we operate in faith, as we operate in giving God our yes again and again, each time we do that, we're watering the seed, putting strong water on the seed. God is watering the seed, and as we make a lifestyle out of it, then we see strong water on the seed more frequently, and we're working the process of growing the plant, if you will. And I wanted to point something out here. If you've been to the Toronto outpouring in the 90s and since then, other places where the Holy Spirit has moved, you may have heard people yelling, "Hey," repeatedly, and not understood what was going on, or maybe partially understood. What they were actually doing was prophesying, making a declaration in the spirit realm with the Hebrew letter, hey. And the Hebrew letter is 5, the numerical value of 5, which has to do with 5 has to do with taking things global. It's the day of creation when the fish and the birds were created, and you had great fruitfulness where the fish and the birds multiplied and they went global and covered the whole earth. So this is right in the creation account. The meaning of the number 5 in the letter Hey has to do with fruitfulness and going global. And we had talked about Abram and Sarai and how their names were changed when their ministry went global, and it was prophesied over them by God himself, and he changed both of their names. He took a yod away from Sarai, which we'll talk about some other time, but what he did is he added the letter Hey to both of their names. He took it global. He made it fruitful. And in this case, he specifically told them that it was going global. Of course, that's what was happening at the Toronto outpouring. It was going global. There was great fruitfulness and great grace. 5 is also a Hebrew letter that denotes grace. So there's so much tied up in this letter Hey. It's all very fascinating. And this letter Hey is tied up with this word Emunah. So if you recall, you've got Amen. And when Bill Johnson came to preach, he talked about increasing our yes. You may hear a lot of sermons out there in this season because that's what one of the messages the prophetic voices have been saying over the last few years is to increase our yes, right? We're supposed to grow in faith. We're supposed to grow in our amen to the Lord. And as God enlarges us, we're able to increase our yes, and our yes today should be greater than our yes was several years ago. So you get these added letters, as we talked about earlier, but you're still getting that basic root in Emunah. This is Emunah I'm writing out here. And what you get is you get the basic root of Amen, right? You get the Aleph, you get the Mem, and you get the Nun, right? So we're still working out of the same basic root word to form the word faith. But what's additional is the letter Vav, which is connecting the water to the seed and making the two one, we could say. They're connected. The water and the seed have become one. So it's no longer an outside source of water watering the seed, but the seed has become saturated with water, and the spiritual meaning there is you have mature faith that's ready to bear fruit, which is where you get the hay from. Out of the saturated seed comes the hay, right? So out of that hay comes the harvest. Out of that hay comes the fruit. We call it fruit. You could call it harvest. So you have the Amen and the Aman, and we work that process, but it reaches a timing, it reaches a tipping point where the fruit, the harvest is ready, the harvest is ripe, and our faith brings forth fruit. And that's a very, very important concept. And it's actually the key to understanding the passage in James, which is actually called the Book of Jacob, if you're not aware of that, in its original title. And it was written to Jewish believers. And in Jacob, he talks about faith and works. And he talks about the faith of Abraham. And he says faith without works is dead. And it's a difficult passage because on the surface, if you read it in the English and you don't understand what you're reading, it seems to contradict Ephesians, which says that we're saved by faith and not by works. So you get this apparent contradiction, between Ephesians, where it says faith, we're saved by faith and not by works, lest any man should boast. It's the grace of God, right? It's God's mercy working. It's His grace working through our faith, and definitely not through our fleshly works or our striving. So then you get this passage in Jacob and James, speaking to Jewish believers about faith and works, and it can be very confusing. And I'm going to explain that in my next part here. But this hay, this emunah, where your mature faith brings forth fruit, I'll give you a little spoiler. If you substitute the word fruit in place of works in those passages in James, or substitute the word harvest in place of works, you'll see it a little more clearly. And we're going to get into that in the next part. So I'm going to leave off with this, and we'll move on to that in the next part. This is the end of the Hebrew Zoom lesson, part 4 for April 30th. Shalom, shalom.